Good afternoon friends and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our today's topic of discussion is secular nationalism in India, and for this very discussion we have with us in our studio Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. He has been teaching for the last 23 years and his area of specialization is Indian politics, India's foreign policy and political theory. And with this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Sir. Thank you for coming, Sir, and I request him to begin our today's lecture.
Thank you, Madam. For today's discussion, we have kept the topic secular nationalism in India and its evolution, its content, and how it has been basically incorporated into entire constitutional discourse of India, that is Indian Constitution. But I would like to divide my presentation into 2-3 parts. The first part I will focus on the concept of nation and nationalism, how India basically moved in direction of a new identity, that is national identity, and how that identity was being denied consistently and continuously by the colonial rulers who were ruling over the society. And they always argued that Indians cannot evolve into a nation, because nation is a modern construct and it is basically the privilege of Western society and Western people, because for basically becoming a nation there are a lot of requirements, and those requirements are basically the modern requirements which a society like India lacks, and therefore they will not be able to evolve themselves into a nation. So this was the argument which was being put forth on behalf of the colonial rule for many years. But it was subsequently challenged by the Indians, and that challenge got channelized into a very powerful national movement against colonial rule, ultimately leading to a situation where India got independence and India framed a constitution, a democratic constitution for itself, a constitution which was basically based on democratic principles of liberty, equality, justice, and also imagine a kind of identity for Indians. That identity one can call a secular national identity. But I think that this entire thing one should remember that evolved as an idea. In fact, nation itself is a subjective construct, as Benedict Anderson, one of the most celebrated author on nationalism, rightly points out that nation is basically a kind of imagined category. Every society has its own way of imagining this new identity that is called nation, and therefore it is imagined thing. And that is perhaps one of the reasons that people make a distinction between nation and the state, whereas it is believed that nation is a subjective construct while the state is an objective expression. But that apart, what I would like to say, that this idea of India, that there is one identity for all Indians irrespective of caste, community, religion, so on and so forth. There is one overarching identity, that is identity of India, and that identity unites Indian people. This was the kind of imagination which came basically on the part of the Indian people. Now that imagination, we should remember, that didn't come just in one stroke. It gradually evolved, and the entire evolution was accompanied with a lot of pulls, pressures, lot of permutations and combination, and finally when that materialized in form of a powerful national movement, that national movement which was led by Indian National Congress, which was formed in 1885, basically many Westerners, particularly the British colonial ideologues and the colonial rulers, they always argued that this new formed unity among Indian people, which is basically giving them an opportunity to imagine or envision a future, a united future, basically a future based on this one identity, is a colonial gift to them, because it is because of the colonial administration, it is because of the colonial colonial development, the development taken by the colonial state. All the initiatives which were taken by the colonial rulers led to this situation where the unification of society, unification of economy, in fact they have taken place, and therefore now people are having more interaction, more exchange, and therefore they feel that they are becoming one. But the fact of the matter is that India is not a nation, but it is a conglomeration of communities, it is a conglomeration of castes and communities and ethnic groups. The moment Britishers should be out from here, they will again revert back to their old position. They will still, they will again go to the original situation, that is situation which was informed by multiple identities and not one identity. So therefore, what the colonial ideologues consistently argued, that there is no idea of India. Basically, there is nothing called Indian identity. The identity which is perhaps important for Indian people is either caste identity or the community identity. And therefore, if there is anything called nation, then there is not one nation but multiple nations, that every group, every ethnic group, every identity, every community can constitute basically a different identity, and therefore it will be tantamount to something called national identity. So this was the bone of contention, and it went on for many years. On the one hand, the denial of this identity, on the other hand, the assertion of this identity. One thing we should remember, but this was not resolved with the independence in 1947. It is true that India got independence, and when Indian constitution was framed, an overarching identity was created, the identity of India based on secular principles, democratic values, basically on citizenship rights and entitlements. And it is basically through that type of construction that Indian state, the post-colonial democratic Indian state, tried to build the foundations of this nation and the state. So basically this nation building project, which started in 1947, was the continuation of the earlier process, but of course in a different form, because earlier this process was going on in the civil society. It was going on behalf of the people in their struggle, but after independence it was taken up by the Indian state on basis of a constitution which was providing a framework for this new identity, that is India. So this is the post-colonial trajectory of the secular nationalism. We will come to this issue later, but to begin with, first of all I would like to basically to put before my audience that there are 2-3 issues which one should remember. Number one, that nation is a modern construct. In fact, nation is basically of modern origin. It emerged in modern times with modernity, with the birth of capitalism, with the rise of capitalism, with number of changes taking place in Europe, and there is no denying the fact that these factors have been considered important for creation of this identity. Now, one thing is there, that this national identity which crystallized in West was essentially based on a linguistic affinity, a linguistic identity. It was on basis of language that most of the nation states in Europe emerged, and it was basically linguistic nationalism. People speaking French became the citizens of France, and therefore they had a French identity. People speaking German became part of the German nationality, and therefore they acquired this new identity called German. Now what happened, that there was a parallel process also where not linguistic nationalism, but it was a religious nationalism which was basically defining this new identity, and it happened mostly in West Asian countries, mostly in the Islamic world, where basically religion became the most important identity for the people, and it was around this identity that this cohesiveness was created, the kind of cohesion which characterizes this nation was created. Now India of course had a problem on account of both, because India was a country where not one language and more than 3,000 languages were spoken. India was a country which was a land where not one religion but at least 3-4 religions basically were born. For example, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and even and Hinduism, and even the Christianity had arrival here much early. even the Islam came here immediately after its rise. So therefore, India was a country where you had multiple languages, you had multiple religious beliefs and practices and faiths. Therefore, it was not possible for India to either imagine or envision a kind of identity based on linguistic nationalism or on basis of religious nationalism, and therefore it was really a big Herculean challenge, and Britishers and the colonial ideologues perhaps realize it. That's why they too often threw this challenge that they cannot emerge as a nation. So much so that one of the British Prime Minister said that India is a geographical, basically reality. It is not a political reality. I mean, there is nothing called nation there. It is geographical reality like equator. So I mean, that was the kind of perception which characterized those ideologues of colonialism and imperialism. Now, what is interesting to see here that this entire fight on this national identity in India was basically fought on the terrain of history, because it was believed that there are 2-3 essential elements which go in creating this identity, and one of the important element is history, along with a culture and language. But history, for Indians, it was believed that there was no history for Indian society, because Indian society's history was always a fragmented history, and it is history which provides a memory, a common memory which binds people, and it is basically this binding, the historical binding based on common memory, which becomes the foundation for the emergence of this identity called nation. But it was argued that the Indians don't have this prevalence of having a history, because what was known as history in India was a divided history. The entire memory was a fragmented memory. For example, it was always believed that ancient history for Indians meant that history for a particular group or community or a particular religion or particular faith. For example, the medieval history, it was believed that similarly was a fragmented history, and therefore it didn't belong to all Indians. Only the modern history, which the Britishers claim that it came with the colonial rule, only this history was in fact a secular history, a history which provided a public sphere, a common identity, certain secular principles for public intercourse, and therefore it was only the secular history of the modern period which could be characterized as history from the modern point of view. So history became a bone of contention from the very beginning. So much so that history and progress, these two elements were always cited by the ideologues of colonialism, and one of the most important ideologue was James Mill, a great political theorist who wrote a book, History of British India. And James Mill's entire argument was basically premised on this fact that the Indians didn't have a history, Indians didn't have basically any experience of living together. It was only the Britishers who have provided a sense of togetherness through their administration, through their economic development, so on and so forth. So what basically was being debated at that time, that progress and history, these are the two important modern attributes, and therefore only British rule in India is basically capable of providing these things to Indian people. Now it was basically on this issue of history that the entire Indian national movement subsequently basically took up this challenge and provided a counter argument, and entire nationalist take on this history is basically important from the point of view of this conflict. Now the best example of writing in this genre, nationalist genre, could be Jawaharlal Nehru's discovery of India. Jawaharlal Nehru's discovery is basically a very powerful attempt to demonstrate that unlike what Britishers claimed, India from the very beginning had a plural, syncretic and glorious history, and that history, the roots lay much deep in time, and therefore he often traced this history to the ancient times, particularly from this Indus Valley civilization. Now what Nehru and other nationalists at that time tried to argue, that the entire claim of the Britishers that Indians didn't have the sense of togetherness, Indians didn't have the sense of belonging to this overarching identity was fallacious. Indians were capable to live together in spite of their religious, ethnic, cultural differences. But if there was any problem among them, the problem was not on account of their history, the problem was not on account of the basically culture, the problem was basically the creation of the colonial rulers who were trying to divide Indian society through their policy of divide and rule, and thereby they wanted to rule over them. So therefore this entire argument of the nationalist leaders, nationalist ideologues, nationalist scholars at that time basically was couched in these terms, that India had a plural syncretic history, and there were examples. Examples were cited from both ancient and medieval times, particularly the two important regimes, ancient and medieval, are often cited as regimes which were characterized by their plurality, syncretism, so on and so forth. One was the great Ashoka's Mauryan period in ancient time, and another was Akbar's reign in medieval time. That how these two emperors symbolize that particular moment in our history when the peoples lived in harmony, when a kind of syncretic political culture they tried to evolve. So therefore this entire argument of the colonial rulers were countered. But in fact this matter didn't stop there. When basically the Britishers tried to introduce modern democratic process in India, at least at a limited scale, through elections and through representation in 1880s, that is famous as basically John Rippon's reforms in 1884. I mean, one of the very important political theorist, ideologue, thinker of liberalism and the West, John Stuart Mill. In fact, he argued that Indians were still not ready for a democracy and representative form of government, because they were still in the waiting room of history, as one of the historians in recent times, Dipesh Chakrabarty, calls it, and rightly so, that waiting room version of history, that Indians were sitting in the waiting room. They had still not attained that sense of maturity. They had still not basically arrived at a situation where they could basically involve themselves or realize the value of freedom, they could realize the value of democracy. So John Stuart Mill, in his famous book on representative government, dismissed this entire possibility of Indians being given this right for democratic governance, and he argued very forcefully that democracy was meant only for those people who were basically from those were from the Western races or the Western origin. For example, he would have endorsed democratic reforms for a country like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on and so forth, which are white colonies, but not for India, because they thought that Indians were still learning this art of modernity, they were still learning the art of democracy, and therefore they were still on the path of progress and they had not attained it because they lacked history. There was no history with them earlier. In fact, it had just started with the colonial rule. So I mean, this was basically a running theme, a running thread throughout this colonial ideology, that how Indians, number one, don't have history, number two, they don't have common memory which can unite them, and number three, that they cannot become a nation, because for nation there are 3-4 important preconditions, and Indians lack all of them. So therefore this was basically one important position. Now what happened, that this entire argument theoretically was challenged, as I have just discussed earlier, that by the nationalist history, and they tried to demonstrate that Indians not only had history but had a glorious history, a rich history, syncretic and plural history. And at the same time, this memory, which is a divided or fragmented memory as it is being presented, is basically a creation of the colonial rule. It is not India's own indigenous problem. So basically this was going on the entire issue of history, culture, memory, and so on and so forth. But politically, this was also contested. And this politically, what happened later, perhaps is more important for the birth and rise of secular nationalism in India. And it is here that we should remember the contribution of social religious reform movement which took place in India from 19th century onward. And one name which basically stands out here is Ram Mohan Roy and his basically entire endeavor to both bring changes in society and religion. Now, it was a social religious reform movement, one can say, that which basically sent out this strong message that if really Indians are interested in emerging as a nation, then the first thing they have to do, that they have to basically ensure that there is a full equality and liberty in the society. Unless they can give liberty and equality to their own people, their own sisters, brothers, they have no right to ask for the similar thing from the Britishers or from the colonial rulers. So this message was loud and clear that unless you have equality and liberty in society, you cannot have a kind of unity of minds and unity of heart which are basically required for the formation of a nation. So social religious reform movement was a powerful intervention at that time. But that process didn't stop. Basically, on the one hand, this entire endeavor was there to unite people through social religious reform movement. On the other hand, the many attempts were made when this regressive impact of colonialism was being felt by the Indian people, and therefore you had a lot of tribals and the peasants movement in 17th and 18th century. Of course, they were unorganized, they were at local level, they didn't have proper planning strategy, and therefore most of them were suppressed. But nonetheless, 1857 is very significant development, that how 1857 jolted the entire colonial rule, the foundation of colonial rule, and therefore after 1857 we find that there is a massive change in both art of government and basically the strategy of the colonial rulers. Now 1857 is a major landmark, and after 1857 we find that earlier when the Britishers were using the strategy of basically history and progress to at least basically dish out their ideology, that they are here for Indian people in their interests, not for the interest of the Britishers or the colonial rulers, because they are here to give Indians sense of history, sense of progress and sense of freedom. But when 1857 a revolt came and it was realized that the Indians were not ready to buy this argument, 1857 onwards we find that suddenly there is a change in the gear of the colonial government, and that change one can see that in shift of their focus from history, progress and freedom to justice and equality. Now it is therefore 1857 onwards you find that there is a very systematic attempt on the part of the colonial rulers to basically understand Indian people and society more systematically and more effectively, and the introduction of this basically decennial census is indication of this fact, that how through census they wanted to collect more definitive information about Indian people, about their social moodings, about their social standing, about their social location. So census is one thing, but at the same time there are a number of attempts at that time on the part of the colonial rule. For example, when the takeover of the colonial administration was took place of the entire thing moved from East India Company to the British Parliament, British Queen also proclaimed neutrality and tolerance so far as their government in India is concerned. So all these changes were taking place. But what I am trying to highlight here, that what was happening at the level of idea, particularly since the advent of the social religious reform movement, after 1857 politically it became more crystallized. And this crystallization one can see in the formation of Indian National Congress in 1885 as a powerful movement of the people. Now it is not that only 1885 you had the organization, but the only difference was that before 1885 there were many organizations, but they were provincial, regional, local. But there was no all India political organization. So Indian National Congress therefore symbolized formation of this Congress, symbolized a very powerful event. Now this was a movement, not a party. It involved many ideologies. It had people believing in different types of vision about India, future India. There were many ideas of India within the Congress. There was no idea, one idea, but one powerful idea which basically was the dominant theme at its inception was the idea of secular nationalism. Now this secular nationalism at that time didn't come in form of secular nationalism, but it came in form of economic nationalism. And perhaps basically the high priest of this economic nationalism at that time was Dadabhai Naoroji, the grand old man who, as it was popularly called. But Dadabhai Nauroji's important contribution for the secular nationalism was in terms of conveying this message that Indians, in spite of their multiple differences, they are still Indian because all of them have common economic interest, and that common economic interest in the progress of the country, that common economic interest in basically the freedom from colonial rule. And therefore it is the economic interest, other words one can say that it is liberty, equality and justice, the three important values of modern times which unite people. There are maybe other differences which may divide them, but the issues or the elements of division are basically negligible compared to the elements of unity, and that can be seen in the common economic struggle, the common economic future. Now it is here that the contribution of this moderates, as they dominated in the Congress in the very first phase, should be remembered, because the moderates were not simply moderates in terms of their strategy for national movement, but moderates were also modernists. They wanted a modern identity for Indian people, and therefore in one of the first few sessions of the Indian National Congress, a very important resolution was passed, and that resolution was that Congress would not adopt any policy which will be opposed by majority of Muslims and majority of Hindus, meaning thereby that Congress would not involve itself with any issue which basically would hurt the sentiments of the two religious communities which were basically dominant at that time. So therefore, the Congress from the very inception realized that what were the areas of basically conflicts, what were the areas in which the Indian identity could become vulnerable, because it was a nascent identity, and that's why they were trying to force this identity. They wanted to weld a new identity around these issues, and therefore they were taking due care. But immediately, as it is part of our known history, that this type of idea of India met with some severe criticisms, and the criticisms were leveled by some other nationalists who believed that entire strategy or entire ideology of the moderates was misplaced, and therefore they wanted to basically anchor Indian identity in Indian culture and Indian civilization, and it was basically this conflict which characterized the last quarter of 19th century. Now that was basically conflict between the moderates and the militant nationalists. The most famous militant nationalists were Aurobindo, Tilak and Bipin Chandra Pal and Lala Lajpat Rai and others. So this was the conflict which was going on. But nonetheless, this element of secular nationalism didn't get diluted. Rather, certain new elements were brought into it, the element of culture and civilization. And this process continued even later. And most significant contribution one can see coming from Gandhi in 1920s. When Gandhi arrives on the political scene, in fact you have a new kind of dimension being added to this entire discourse. It is to be remembered that both Gandhi and Tagore were not great votary of nationalism. They are basically votary of certain international solidarities and values based on humanity. But nonetheless, in Indian context, Gandhi believed that the contradiction which had emerged between the colonial rulers, the imperialism and the Indian people, that contradiction had to be resolved. And therefore, in spite of his strong reservation about this idea of nation, Gandhi forcefully believed that nationalism was becoming a very important identity for Indian people. Unlike Tagore, who till the end believed that nationalism is one identity which is basically divisive, which is basically eroding certain human values which characterize humanity and global peace and order. But that apart, what we find at 20th century, this entire secular nationalism gains a new momentum and acquires a new kind of framework. For example, when the Gandhi emerges on the scene, there are three important changes taking place. The first important change is that from elites discourse, this secular nationalism moves in direction of people's discourse. For example, it became a people's movement. Now, Gandhi, the first important initiative on the part of the Gandhi was to involve the Indian people with this construct called India. I mean, this entire attempt, as it was being made from the days of the Ram Mohan Roy, the social religious reform movement, when he wanted to send out this message that unless Indian society witnesses the moments of liberty, justice and equality, it would be difficult for Indian people to get united with this new concept, the new identity. And therefore, the most important thing is that first of all the Indian people should feel the value of equality and justice. And that's why a person who continuously argued and fought against the sati system, against the caste system and many other social evils, and the person who was instrumental even in demanding from the Britishers the modern English education, because he believed that unless these modern ideas, modern knowledge system are given to the Indian people, they would not realize the value of freedom and equality. So this was the kind of renaissance, one can say, in Indian context. Now in 20th century, what we find that we have a powerful political movement which joins hands with the earlier attempt to reform society, religion and so forth, so on and so forth. And this political initiative one can see in form of this Gandhian intervention. Now this Gandhian intervention takes place in 1920s, because of course he comes in 1915, but by 1920 when he starts his non-cooperation movement, what we find that for the first time you have the entire national movement turning as a mass movement, and therefore 1920 onwards this discourse of secular nationalism moves in a different direction. One can say that secularism at that time and nationalism both were given certain new features, certain new dimensions. First of all, this nationalism became the nationalism of the people, and secondly, secularism, that is the non-discrimination, that there shouldn't be any discrimination on basis of religion, caste, creed, and so on and so forth, were also infused new values, in the form of this Gandhian movement. But at the same time, the challenges were also emerging to secular nationalism. The earlier challenges, as I just mentioned, were basically mostly among the Indian elites, one group anchoring it on basis of economic justice, another group trying to anchor it on foundation of Indian culture and civilization. But later on what we find that now the challenges which started coming were of different nature. Now the challenge, the most powerful challenge at that time came from the Muslim League, when it demanded that India didn't have one nation, but India had two nations based on religious identity. And this entire narrative, the entire politics around this nation acquired a new dimension, and therefore that culminated into finally the partition of India in 1947, when India decided to continue as a secular nation, whereas Pakistan became a theocratic state based on their religious identity. So I mean, this process of 1920s, the Gandhian intervention, had its repercussions, and one important repercussion one can see in this partition of the country and the attempt of the Muslim League. But one thing we should remember, that this Muslim League politics didn't start with Gandhi, because Muslim League was founded in 1906, and therefore one should try to look at the entire division within Indian nationalism in 19th century itself. And therefore when the Britishers after 1857 faced a major challenge in India, what they tried to do, that they wanted to basically change their entire strategy from the discourse of freedom, progress and history, as I just mentioned, and they moved in a different direction, that was equality and justice. And they consistently argued that India was such a fragmented and society that the Indians, the oppressed Indians, the minorities, those who do not constitute majority, they will not get justice at the hands of the Indians. Only Britishers can ensure them justice. And therefore at that time the two important tools they devised, one was the separate electorates. They wanted to create a separate category in politics where the entire democratic process or the politics in whatever form it was going on was based on sectarian identity and sectarian ideology, not a kind of cohesive universal concerns which characterize any democratic process. So, this sectarianism in their policies, which emerged in form of separate representation, of course had different connotations. Only Britishers couldn't be blamed for all these things. There were problems in Indian society as well, and this is what the social reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Vivekanand, and even to some extent one can say the reformers among Islam, I mean among the Muslims like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Aligarh school. So they were trying to address, but nonetheless what we find that the seeds of discord basically were sown around that time, and therefore in 20th century what happens that all on a sudden we find that this entire thing becomes more explosive, and this explosion one can feel after 1928. 1928 is basically the Nehru Committee, the most important event so far as the political history of 20th century and 19th century is concerned. Now, Nehru Committee was perhaps the first important attempt by the Indians to create a common framework of administration and governance for themselves, because after the Britishers failed in their endeavor to prove that Indians didn't have history, they subsequently turned to this issue that Indians are not capable of writing a constitution for themselves. At least they cannot write a constitution which will be acceptable to us, all caste communities and groups. So 1928, the Indians not only took this challenge, but they moved with full confidence when they constituted a committee under Motilal Nehru, and this committee was formed by all parties conference, and this was the first attempt by Indians to write a constitution, modern constitution, with a common framework of administration and governance. But what happened, unfortunately, the 1928 initiative didn't succeed, and after 1928 we find that this problem, which was smoldering at that time, became more prominent and more explosive, and subsequently with the 1940 the Muslim League resolution in Lahore, when they demanded a separate nationhood. But this was the one dimension of interrogation of this secular nationalism. But there were other issues as well, and the second important interrogation came from Ambedkar and the depressed classes. And here one should remember the most famous debate between Ambedkar and Gandhi, which took place in Second Roundtable Conference in London in 1931. And there, when Ambedkar was pressing for separate representation for the depressed classes, and Gandhi's position was different, and that led to a kind of debate which subsequently resulted into the penning of the Pune Pact, which has been very controversial since then. But I mean, what was basically argued from the point of view of the depressed classes by Ambedkar was basically something similar in nature, that Indians cannot claim to be a nation simply because a nation implies a common memory, number one, and number two, nation implies equality, liberty and justice. An Indian social order is as characterized by caste system is deficient on that count, because there is no equality, no liberty and no justice, and therefore how can they claim that all Indians, irrespective of their caste, community and creed, constitute one nation? So basically the precondition, the prerequisite of this nationhood is equality and liberty, and therefore unless that is ensured, there is no basis for this claim that India is a nation. So I mean, this was another important interrogation. But that interrogation was along different line. It was trying simply to basically highlight the fault line within this nationhood. And this fault line was basically not only realized and basically acknowledged, but subsequently you find that there is a powerful attempt to rectify this fault line. And Indian constitution therefore is a very important moment in Indian history and Indian in known history of India, when the attempt was made to address all these concerns for the formation of modern nationhood. So this nation building project therefore after independence and through these interrogations basically reaches a very important point, and that is basically the drafting of the constitution. Now, when India is basically trying to create a constitutional framework for itself, the first important thing it does, that in basically preamble, it declares that the people are the sovereign basically entity, basically the power flows from the people, and therefore it is a kind of democratic fountainhead of power in Indian discourse on nation and the state. So therefore the preamble is perhaps gives an important clue that how Indian nation should be approached and understood. Now there are many other elements in the new constitution which one can say basically reflect the 200 years of struggles, which reflect to some extent the values of secular nationalism, which reflects that how Indians were conscious of the many fault lines which lay within this nationhood and how they try to address them, and therefore the most important component of Indian constitution becomes secularism. Now it is a different matter that secularism term in Indian preamble is incorporated only through an amendment, and that is much later in 70s, but nonetheless if one basically goes into the details of the Indian constitution, one finds that secularism is the running basically thread in the entire constitutional document. So much so that one of the most celebrated author on Indian secularism, E.D. Smith, his famous book which was written in 1960s, Secularism, India as a Secular State. Now he talks of three important principles of secularism, and he says that first important principle is basically equality, the second important principle is liberty, and the third important principle is neutrality. And all these three principles one can find in Indian constitution. By liberty, basically he talks of the religious liberty which Indian constitution guarantees. When he talks, he refers to equality, he basically means by equality non-discrimination, and non-discrimination is an essential element of Indian constitution, at least in the fundamental rights. For example, Article 16. Now, when it talks of neutrality, and in other words, in the secular parlance, in the parlance of the secular discourse, one can say that it is a disestablishment, that there shouldn't be any relationship between religion and the state authority and power. Now, this neutrality one also finds very much there and prominent in the fundamental rights section of the Indian constitution. So, all these three elements one finds that coming into in the constitution in a big way. Not only secularism, but one finds that even the democracy, the democratic rights, both in terms of fundamental rights and in terms of many other legal and other rights, they are there. Now then the third important thing is basically a kind of framework through which a kind of economic justice is sought to be delivered, and therefore you have the entire section on directive principles of state policy. Now, directive principles of state policy of course is not a justiciable provision, but nonetheless those provisions are meant to deliver economic justice to Indian people. So you have basically on the one hand non-justiciable directive principles of state policy, on the other hand you have justiciable fundamental rights. So therefore you have a combination of both the political freedom and economic justice, and thereby trying to kind of an attempt one can see there to create a kind of framework for a nationhood, a secular nationhood in India. A common nationhood, one can say that a kind of unforced allegiance to a sense of belongingness to a political authority, irrespective of caste, creed, community and other types of identity. So this nation building project of the post-independent India is very significant, and what is equally significant that this nation building project now is being basically carried forward through a democratic process. Earlier, as I mentioned, that it was part of the civil society discourse, not part of the state discourse, because state power was in the hands of the colonial rulers, and only people had their presence and their resources in civil society. So basically this entire national movement, as we have discussed before independence, was basically located in the civil society. But after independence, when the Indian people acquired political power, what we find that the nation and state both join hands. Now, it is this joining of hands between the nation and state where we find that this new initiative of a nation building project. Therefore, we often hear about a term nation in making, that India is a nation in making, because this is basically a kind of process through which this bonding is sought to be solidified, is a kind of attempt through which this new cohesive identity is continuously created. To basically mention here the famous words of Renan, the great scholar on nationalism, who said that nation is like a daily plebiscite, that the way a plebiscite takes the opinion of the people at the end of the day, that on any particular issue. So, on nation also, the nation building is some sort of plebiscite. The people's opinion are sought on day-to-day basis about their sense of belongingness, whether they feel united or they don't feel united. And it is here democracy becomes a very important tool for basically forging this identity. So, therefore, this secular nationalism in India after independence basically becomes the project of a democratic project, and therefore, with the periodic elections after every 5 years through which people are empowered, because as I mentioned that in preamble itself it is mentioned that the people are basically ultimate sovereign, basically fountainhead of power, and therefore democracy becomes a tool to not only empower people but also to create this sense of oneness, sense of belonging, so that they can feel that they are basically not only citizens with empty words, but they are citizens with real power. So, this democratic process becoming a vehicle and tool of this nation building project after independence. But that doesn't mean that there are no areas of concern or there are no problems. There are many issues on which this secular nation building project even after independence is basically facing flack or basically running into trouble, and therefore it is a continuous basically project of Indian people and Indian state, that how India can basically acquire this powerful identity called idea of India. Now, there is a famous book with this title, but in fact the entire thing, idea of India, was first of all used by Rabindranath Tagore, that it is an idea. Well, we have to celebrate this idea. Now, this celebration of this idea can be through a democratic instrumentality. Now, we can celebrate this idea through a kind of tolerant behavior, and therefore tolerance becomes very important for the survival of the nation state or the secular nation state. Now, this tolerance, which one can say in other words, is basically synonymous with, or if not synonymous, then very equivalent to what we normally talk of secularism, because secularism after all also stands for tolerance. So, basically therefore, what we find that this celebration of democracy, the celebration of tolerance and celebration of a common fellow feeling, a common destiny, economic justice for all, equality and liberty, all these things are basically the cornerstone for the secular nationalism today, and its survival would also depend on basically the kind of effectiveness, efficacy, and kind of basically operationalization of these constitutional values which have been guaranteed in the constitution. And we have a very vibrant political culture with political institutions like legislature, executive and judiciary, with a doctrine of separation of power and institutional basically responsibility to ensure that all these things are delivered to Indian people so that they can charter out their future within the framework of this secular nationalism. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, sir, for the very interesting presentation, and with this I would like to ask you a few questions which could probably add to our discussion also. Sir, what would you say are the challenges to secular nationalism in pertaining to our discussion today?
Yes, it's a very interesting question, because as I have already discussed that before independence you had a different set of challenges to secular nationalism.
Right.
And those challenges were addressed very effectively in Indian constitution when we were drafting our constitution.
Right, sir.
But post 1947 you have the interrogation of the similar values or similar thing, but on a different note. Now what has happened in last 60 years of our democracy, that perhaps becomes the basis for the new challenge and new interrogation.
Absolutely.
For example, what we are witnessing today, that you have a lot of protests and struggles going on for making the system more accountable and more representative.
Definitely.
For example, few years ago we heard that how the civil society movement was going on.
Right.
That now it is not only the representatives of the people, but people themselves who should basically have this power to basically decide their own fate and future.
Right.
Therefore, I mean, this is one particular area which one can figure out that is the emerging concern.
Right.
Because
right.
on the one hand, the constitution settles for a representative form of government. On the other hand, you have the movements, you have the people and their aspirations which demand a different type of institutional format where the people should have more say in the governance of the society and polity.
Right.
So that is one. And second challenge, what we find, that there are certain oppressed sections, vulnerable groups in the society, for example women,
Right.
the tribals, the Dalits, and they have been given different types of freedom, different type of security, different type of protections in the constitution.
Right.
But sometimes it is believed that it is still much to be desired. There are a lot of things which need to be done on front of them, because unless the different sections of people get united with this concept and idea of India,
of course,
you cannot claim that India is a success story so far as nation building project is concerned.
Right, sir.
So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for enumerating these challenges. And sir, I would like to ask you, sir, with the practice of secular nationalism, the idea, how does it become strengthened after coming of democracy?
Oh yes, yeah. In fact, this is another very interesting theme to basically explore, that how democracy basically rather strengthens the foundation of secular nationalism.
Right, right.
Because in other words, one can say that in India, democracy came in form of nationalism. That argument which was being put forth for nationalism was also the argument which was for democracy.
Right.
So
right,
basically, both became coterminous to some extent. But after independence, as I mentioned, that this entire nation building project has been going on through a democratic process.
Absolutely.
So I mean, nation in making, what we are hearing earlier, and this nation building project through democracy, and it is here that political democracy is as important as the constitutional democracy.
Absolutely.
The constitutional democracy we can see in basically the constitutional provisions of the constitution, which you have a very vibrant judiciary to see that whether those provisions are being enforced or not.
Right.
But you have the political democracy through periodic elections, through people's participation in the democratic process, and then kind of a sense of belongingness getting strengthened every now and then through this election.
Right,
So I think both are feeding into each other.
Definitely.
And therefore, one can say that democracy is perhaps one of the most powerful instruments through which this entire discourse of secular nationalism can be carried forward.
Right, right. Thank you, sir, for that. And sir, of course, we make this part of our every lecture, that we ask the subject experts for a list of books, or perhaps one or two books that the students can specifically refer to when they're dealing with this topic.
Yeah, in fact, there are some very interesting books on this issue. In fact, one is by Sunil Khilnani's Idea of India. This is a very interesting book which deals with this entire Indian story, that how this idea of India has emerged.
Right.
Then there is also a book by E.D. Smith, India as a Secular State, published in 1960, but I mean it is still considered a classic work on Indian discourse on secularism and nationalism. And then you have Partha Chatterjee's Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World. So I mean this is another interesting book. So those who would like to pursue it further, they can basically consult these books, and I'm sure they will enjoy reading them.
Right, absolutely, sir. Thank you for this list of books. Of course, the students, while studying this, can also consult these books and or get a wider perspective on things. And sir, just curious, this topic, say, what would you say, at what level does a student start studying the concept of secular nationalism?
Both level. In social sciences, you have at undergraduate level both at honors and the general, the past
Right,
course level.
right, sir.
You have this engagement with the nation, Indian nation.
Absolutely.
And at the higher studies, in fact, in postgraduate level of social sciences, not only political science, but
Right,
history,
right.
political science, even literature, whether it's English literature or
Absolutely,
Hindi literature or the
absolutely.
vernacular literature. You have very vibrant engagement with at least the different thinkers of modern India who had something important to contribute on
Right,
nationalism, whether
right,
Tagore
sir.
or Gandhi or Nehru or for that
Absolutely,
matter.
that's
So I
quite
think
true.
that this theme, in contemporary times, the students pursue both at undergraduate and the postgraduate level. To some extent, one can say that even in schools these days,
Right.
there are many areas in which these issues are discussed. Very
Right,
often.
so this starts
important.
coming at a very early
Very
level. So with this, I would like to say thank you for coming here and sparing your valuable time. And I also request you, also on behalf of our students, that you would be associated with us on future occasions as well,
It
sir.
is my pleasure.
That would be lovely, sir. And thank you so much, viewers, for watching. Have a lovely day ahead.